The moment the room fell silent was not after a thunderous applause, nor a grand announcement, but after something far uglier, an interruption. Dan Sullivan leaned forward, his voice slicing through Jasmine Crockett's words with a sharp, practiced arrogance. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. But this time, the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the walls of the debate hall knew history was pressing in. "Excuse me," he barked again, louder, sharper, determined to cut her down mid-sentence. Crockett's words that had carried stories of struggle and survival, were smothered under his dismissive tone. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some gasped, others muttered. Viewers at home froze, fists tightening, eyes widening. It was more than rudeness. It was spectacle, and Sullivan reveled in it. For him, interruption was power. He wore it like armor, convinced that volume could drown out truth. But to those watching, it felt different. It felt personal. Every immigrant whose accent was mocked, every woman told to quiet down, every working family ignored at the table of privilege, they saw themselves in Jasmine Crockett at that moment. They recognized the pattern, and outrage began to spark. Social media timelines erupted in real time. Why won't he let her speak? This is beyond disrespect. Memes formed before the debate even ended, framing Sullivan's interruptions not as strength, but as insecurity masked in bluster. Yet Crockett, calm but unyielding, refused to mirror his arrogance. She steadied herself, her silence sharper than any insult. That silence was deafening. Cameras caught it, the nation felt it, and Sullivan, unaware of the trap he was laying for himself, pushed harder. He smirked, waved his hand, tried again to bulldoze over her presence. He thought he was winning, but the ground beneath him was already cracking. Because what was about to unfold wasn't just another exchange of words. It wasn't politics as usual. This was about dignity versus arrogance, composure versus chaos, truth versus noise. And as Crockett finally lifted her eyes, as she prepared to answer in a way no one in that room could forget, one question pulsed across every living room, phone screen, and watch party in America. What happens when the voice you tried to silence refuses to stay silent? And that was the moment no one was ready for.
The debate took place in a chamber that was meant to symbolize democracy at work, a forum where ideas could be weighed and judged in the open, where voices of the people's representatives would echo equally. But on this night, equality was nowhere to be found. The cameras rolled, the audience leaned forward, and beneath the bright lights, the stage transformed into something else entirely, a battleground of respect, identity, and power. The official topic was policy, yet policy barely mattered anymore. What unfolded was not simply about budgets or committee decisions. It was about whether a woman of color, an unapologetic truth-teller, could hold her ground in a space designed to keep her silent. Sullivan's interruptions weren't just rudeness. They were a performance of dominance, an old script replayed through centuries, a man leveraging arrogance to smother dignity, hoping that noise would eclipse substance. And viewers recognized it instantly. Across living rooms, offices, and crowded bars, people shook their heads, their pulses rising. They had seen this before, not just in politics, but in classrooms, workplaces, family dinners. It was the everyday indignity of being spoken over, dismissed, diminished. This debate wasn't merely about Sullivan and Crockett. It was about every voice that ever struggled to be heard. News tickers exploded across the screen as the interruptions continued. Crockett interrupted again. Debate spirals into chaos. Online, the hashtags were relentless. Hashtag let her speak shot to the trending list within minutes. Memes showed Sullivan with his hand raised, superimposed with captions like, "When you've run out of arguments, just talk louder." Commentators scrambled to interpret what viewers already felt. This wasn't harmless debate theater. It was a referendum on respect itself. What made it sting even deeper was the symbolism. Sullivan, with his years in power, embodied the establishment that are too often dismissed newcomers. Crockett represented something fresher, rawer, more connected to lived experience. To silence her was to silence that entire narrative, to slam the door on communities who had fought for centuries to even have a seat in the room. And that made every interruption feel like a theft. The chamber itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Supporters of Crockett leaned forward, fists clenched, while Sullivan's allies tried to mask their unease. Each exchange piled on top of the last, each cutoff stacking insult upon insult. The atmosphere was no longer about points won or lost. It was about respect denied or defended. By now, Crockett's composure had become its own act of defiance. She could have shouted back, could have matched Sullivan's aggression, blow for blow. Instead, she let his interruptions reveal themselves, one after another, until the pattern was unmistakable. The arrogance no longer looked powerful. It looked desperate. And desperation is a weakness that audiences are quick to smell. Social media lit up with emotional validation. "She's all of us right now, calm while they try to tear us down. This isn't a debate, it's a mirror of America." The digital ripple spread fast, carrying outrage, solidarity, and a hunger for Crockett's response. Everyone sensed that something bigger was unfolding, something beyond a single event. Because by this point, the debate had shifted from policy to principle. It wasn't about legislation. It was about the unwritten rules of democracy, about who is allowed to be heard and who is pushed to the margins. It was no longer just Crockett standing on that stage. It was every silenced voice standing with her. And as the interruptions piled higher, the tension reached its breaking point. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was about power, dignity, and who would blink first.
Long before the debate stage, where he attempted to silence Jasmine Crockett, Dan Sullivan had built a reputation for wielding arrogance like a weapon. To his supporters, he was seasoned, a man who, quote, didn't mince words. But to those who watched closely, his style was less about conviction and more about control, less about leadership and more about dismissal. He represented the old guard, a relic of a political era that thrived on talking over rather than listening to. Sullivan's career had always carried the unmistakable thread of entitlement. Born into privilege, groomed in circles where respect was a given rather than earned, he entered politics with the confidence of someone who had never truly been questioned. That confidence hardened into condescension as the years passed. Committee hearings, press conferences, town halls, all became stages where Sullivan's instinct was not to engage, but to belittle. One of his earliest controversies is still whispered about among activists, a town hall meeting where constituents pressed him on healthcare access. Instead of addressing the heartfelt stories, single mothers juggling 2 jobs, veterans waiting months for care, Sullivan cut them short, waving his hand as though brushing away nets. "That's anecdotal," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Cameras caught the moment, the dismissive smirk, the crossed arms. For many, it was the first time they realized that to him, lived experience meant little. Policy was abstract, statistics were armor, and the human beings behind them were obstacles. In another instance, during a Senate committee debate on climate policy, Sullivan interrupted a colleague mid-sentence, not to counter her argument, but to mock her credentials. "With all due respect," he said, dripping sarcasm, "we'll leave the science to the scientists and the governing to those of us with experience." The irony, of course, was sharp. Scientists had just testified
in the same chamber, their warnings dismissed as alarmist. To Sullivan, expertise mattered only when it validated his position. But perhaps the most telling story came from a closed-door meeting leaked years later. Staffers described how Sullivan cut off a young congressional aide who dared to question the long-term effects of a proposed bill. "Son, don't overthink it. This is politics, not philosophy." The remark spread quickly, an unguarded window into how he viewed governance, not as stewardship, but as a game where voices could be muted if they challenged his authority. Each of these moments painted a portrait, a man convinced that volume equals victory, that interruption equals dominance. He was the embodiment of an establishment that had too often treated democracy like a club for the few rather than a table for the many. And yet Sullivan wore this entitlement like a badge of honor, interpreting pushback not as criticism, but as proof of his toughness. But arrogance has a way of rotting the foundation beneath it. Every interruption, every dismissive wave of the hand left cracks in his image. Activists replayed his town hall dismissals on loop, fueling grassroots campaigns. Commentators dissected his smirks, framing them as symbols of the very elitism voters claimed to despise. And even fellow politicians, quietly at first, began to distance themselves from the bluster, noting privately that his aggression often undermined the very arguments he was trying to make. And yet, Sullivan never saw it. To him, dominance was proof of strength. The louder he spoke, the more he believed he was winning. The more interruptions, the more he convinced himself he was in control. But audiences, especially younger, more diverse audiences, saw through it. What he believed to be strength appeared more like insecurity, a refusal to face the possibility that his worldview was slipping into irrelevance. By the time he faced Jasmine Crockett, he had already become a character type, an archetype of the old political order. He wasn't just one man interrupting one opponent, he was the living symbol of a system where power was hoarded and wielded like a blunt instrument. His arrogance was no longer just a personality flaw, it was a cautionary tale. And like every tale of arrogance, the pattern was clear. The higher the pedestal, the sharper the fall. Sullivan's history wasn't simply a backdrop, it was the script he carried with him into the debate. A script that told him interruptions worked, that dominance prevailed, that dignity could be drowned out by noise. What he didn't realize, as he leaned forward once more to silence Jasmine Crockett, was that this time, the script was about to flip. Because arrogance, in the end, always plants the seeds of its own downfall. And for Dan Sullivan, those seeds were about to bear fruit under the unforgiving glare of the debate lights.
Long before she stood beneath the searing lights of the debate stage, Jasmine Crockett had already been tempered by battles far more personal, far more punishing than any interruption from Dan Sullivan. Her story did not begin in the marble halls of government. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity had to be fought for, where dignity had to be defended daily against indifference, bias, and dismissal. And it was precisely those roots that made her voice resonate so fiercely with millions. Crockett's journey was never cushioned by privilege. Raised in a working-class family, she knew from the start that nothing would be handed to her. She carried the lessons of resilience from parents who balanced multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. She remembered the quiet dignity of her mother, who reminded her that hard work was not just about survival, but about contribution, about proving that voices like theirs could not only belong, but could lead. Her early years in school offered glimpses of the battles to come. Teachers often underestimated her, assuming that the quiet black girl in the back row could be overlooked. But Crockett refused invisibility. She raised her hand, challenged unfair grading, demanded explanations. That defiance wasn't about arrogance, it was about justice. She knew even then that silence was the weapon of those who wanted to diminish her, and she would never wield it against herself. Law school only sharpened her edge. Surrounded by peers who had family names etched into the country's political fabric, Crockett had to carve her space by sheer force of preparation. While others coasted on connections, she outworked them. Long nights over case books,
early mornings and internships where she fought for clients who had no one else. This was where she learned that the law, at its best, was a tool of dignity, not domination. As an attorney, Crockett built her reputation on defending those dismissed by the system, immigrants targeted by bureaucracy, working families cheated by landlords, protesters silenced by authorities. Her clients often walked into courtrooms feeling small, unheard, but Crockett gave them presence. She spoke with a fire that reminded judges and juries alike that every human being carried worth, no matter their background, no matter their resources. In those moments, she wasn't just defending individuals, she was defending the principle that justice was not a privilege, but a right. That reputation carried into politics. When Crockett stepped into public office, she brought with her the same fierce empathy. Constituents quickly realized she was not a politician who spoke at them, but with them. Town halls were not performances, they were conversations. She listened, she remembered names, she carried stories into legislative chambers where they could no longer be ignored. What made her voice powerful was not only its clarity, but its authenticity. She didn't craft words for applause, she crafted them for impact. When she spoke about poverty, she wasn't citing statistics detached from reality, she was recalling neighbors she grew up with. When she spoke about healthcare, she wasn't regurgitating party lines, she was thinking about families she had represented in courtrooms, pleading for access to basic care. Every word she uttered carried the weight of lived truth. And so, when Sullivan attempted to drown her out, the clash became more than a battle between two individuals. It was a collision between entitlement and earned authority, between arrogance and empathy. Sullivan's interruptions were predictable, the recycled tactics of a man who had been told his voice mattered more. But Crockett's resilience was unique, sharpened by years of having to demand space in rooms that didn't want to give it. She'd been told quiet down her entire life, and each time she had answered not with silence, but with strength. That is why her supporters saw themselves in her. Immigrant families who had been dismissed at borders, women who had been interrupted in boardrooms, young activists who had been mocked by older politicians. They all recognized their own battles in her composure. Crockett was not just one person on stage. She was a vessel for countless stories of resistance and dignity. But what made her story inspiring was not simply defiance. It was her ability to balance firmness with grace. Crockett never allowed arrogance to define her response. Instead, she met disrespect with clarity, injustice with reason, arrogance with composure. This balance disarmed opponents who expected her to erupt. Instead, she left them exposed, revealing that their aggression was weakness and her calm was power. By the time she walked into the debate hall where Sullivan waited, her life had already been a preparation for that moment. Every dismissal she endured in childhood, every courtroom where she demanded her clients be heard, every committee meeting where she had to outwork and outthink those armed with legacy rather than merit, all of it had built to this. And as Sullivan leaned in, arrogant and unshaken in his old habits, he had no idea that the woman sitting across from him was not merely a political opponent. She was the sum of every voice that had ever been silenced, every person that had been dismissed, every community that had been overlooked. Her moment was coming. The stage was set. And in just a few exchanges, Jasmine Crockett would turn the tables in a way that would leave not only Sullivan, but the entire nation stunned.
The first interruption came like a strike of lightning, sudden, sharp, and jarring. Jasmine Crockett had barely completed her opening line before Dan Sullivan leaned in, voice raised just enough to smother hers. "That's not accurate," he declared, waving his hand dismissively, as though the mere gesture could erase her words from the air. Crockett paused, lifted her chin slightly, and let the silence speak for her. The moderator tried to intervene, but Sullivan pressed again, louder this time. No, let me finish." He hadn't even started, yet somehow he insisted on finishing. Crockett's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, the kind that carried both patience
and quiet defiance. She knew this rhythm. She had lived it before. The pattern was predictable, and she was prepared. The interruptions multiplied. Each time she began to speak, whether on policy, on principle, or on lived experience, Sullivan's voice thundered in like a blunt instrument crashing through delicate glass. He didn't just cut her off, he steamrolled, throwing phrases meant not to engage but to overwhelm. That's irrelevant. You don't understand. Let me correct you. Each interjection layered insult upon insult. But Crockett's composure was unshaken. She steadied her breath, choosing restraint over retaliation. Her calmness was its own weapon. To the audience, her poise radiated strength. To Sullivan, it was infuriating. The more composed she became, the more desperate he appeared. His words grew sharper, his interruptions more frequent, his tone increasingly brittle. The chamber reflected the shift. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, an uneasy recognition that something was off balance. Supporters of Crockett exchanged glances, whispering with irritation. Even those neutral to the contest fidgeted in their seats, sensing the impropriety of it all. Online, the commentary was swift and unrelenting, Twitter threads multiplied by the second. He's scared of her voice. This is what insecurity looks like. She's handling this like a queen. And still, Crockett held the line. She did not raise her voice to match his. She did not lunge at the bait. Instead, she let him continue to reveal himself. Every time he interrupted, she paused deliberately, allowing the weight of his arrogance to hang in the air. Every pause became a mirror, reflecting his desperation for dominance. The debate stage no longer felt like a contest of ideas. It had morphed into something rawer, more symbolic, a clash between noise and clarity, between arrogance and dignity. Sullivan was playing the role of aggressor with gusto, yet the more he pressed, the more he looked cornered by his own tactics. Crockett, meanwhile, was unmoving, unyielding, her very silence louder than his shouting. The nation was transfixed. Clips spread across social platforms in real time. Sullivan leaning forward, finger jabbing in the air. Crockett leaning back, unbothered, eyes steady. The contrast was cinematic. Chaos versus calm. Desperation versus discipline. And for viewers who had endured similar dynamics in their own lives, at work, at home, in classrooms, the symbolism cut deep. By now, even the moderator's interventions were drowned out. The debate was spiraling. What should have been an exchange of policy had become a spectacle of character. Sullivan thought he was winning ground, but in truth, he was digging himself deeper into a pit, and the crowd could feel it. Murmurs grew into audible sighs, whispers into exasperated chuckles. Crockett's moment was coming. She had allowed the interruptions to stack, to expose themselves for what they were, not strength, but fear. She had allowed Sullivan's arrogance to overplay its hand, and now she was ready. The room tensed as she leaned forward at last, eyes locked, her voice prepared to pierce through the storm he had created. And then, as if on cue, Crockett delivered the line that froze Sullivan in his seat.
For a moment, the room hung in suspended tension. Sullivan, red-faced and flustered, had pushed his interruptions to their limit. His voice cracked under the weight of his own arrogance, and the smug confidence that had carried him into countless debates faltered ever so slightly. Crockett, on the other hand, leaned forward with measured calm, her eyes unwavering, her breathing controlled, every gesture precise. She had waited for this exact moment, and the audience could feel it before she even spoke. The first words were deliberate, almost gentle, yet they carried an invisible hammer. "I will not be interrupted," she said, each syllable deliberate, each pause intentional,
as if daring him to challenge her again. The crowd shifted, leaning in as if magnetized by her composure. The cameras captured every inch of Sullivan's discomfort, tightened jaw, shifting stance, hands twitching near the podium. But Crockett's gaze remained steady, unwavering, unflinching. Her next line cut deeper, striking at the heart of what had been hidden beneath Sullivan's interruptions, entitlement disguised as authority. "When we speak over one another, we do not demonstrate strength," she continued, her voice calm but forceful. "We reveal fear. Fear of being confronted with truths we do not want to hear." The words landed like a scalpel. The crowd exhaled collectively, the tension snapping with the subtle acknowledgement that this was no ordinary debate, it was a reckoning. Sullivan opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett anticipated him, leaving a pause long enough to let the room's energy build. Each heartbeat felt amplified, each second stretched into eternity. The audience sensed a turning point, an invisible pivot upon which the entire debate now rested. Social media lit up instantly. Hashtags flashed across timelines. Hashtag Crockett claps back. Hashtag shook. Hashtag respect her voice. Thousands of comments poured in, praising her poise, her intellect, her courage. Viewers described it as a masterclass in dignity under fire. Crockett's tone shifted slightly, growing firmer, more resolute. "I stand here not just for myself," she said, her eyes scanning the room, connecting with the audience, the moderators, even those who had come expecting chaos. "I stand for every voice that has ever been dismissed, every story that has been interrupted, every person told that their experience does not matter." There was no bitterness, no mockery, just pure, unassailable authority. The room responded with a ripple of applause that seemed to shake the air. Sullivan faltered. His usual tactic of bluster and interruption no longer worked. Each attempt to regain control only underscored his growing panic. The smirk that had defined him was gone, replaced by a tightening around his eyes, a subtle but unmistakable sign of unease. Crockett's calm dominance had revealed the cracks in his armor, and for the first time in the debate, he looked unsure, rattled. The audience could see it, feel it, and the validation surged online. Memes exploded, framing Sullivan as flustered, while Crockett radiated authority. Clips of her delivery circulated endlessly, with captions reading, "She didn't just respond, she commanded the room." Every line Crockett delivered was layered with purpose. She highlighted policy missteps, exposed inconsistencies, and tied them to values that mattered to ordinary people. Her words were both surgical and cinematic, carefully paced, alternating between pointed critique and human storytelling. She described families struggling to access health care, communities overlooked by politicians who spoke loudly but acted little, and the persistent injustices that came when voices were ignored. Each anecdote was a mirror, reflecting not just the debate, but the lived reality of those watching. By the midpoint of her counterattack, Sullivan's composure was completely unraveling. He raised his hand as if to interrupt, but no words came. Crockett's pauses had created a rhythm he could not penetrate. Each silence was a spotlight, and in that light, his arrogance shrank. The crowd's reactions became louder, the applause more insistent, the energy in the room building to an almost cinematic crescendo. The audience was not just watching, they were participating, emotionally invested in the dismantling of entitlement before them. Crockett delivered the final segment of her counterattack with precision. Her voice carried authority, empathy, and moral clarity in equal measure. "We are not measured by how loudly we speak over others, but by how faithfully we uphold the dignity of every person in this nation." And dignity, she emphasized, letting the word hang in the air. Dignity cannot be interrupted. The line landed like a drumbeat, punctuating the climax of the evening, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Even Sullivan's allies could not ignore it. The carefully curated facade of dominance had cracked, revealing vulnerability, insecurity, and the stark reality that arrogance, when confronted by truth and composure, collapses under its own weight. Every interruption he had delivered now seemed futile, a monument to his own hubris. The contrast between the two figures was undeniable. Crockett's dignity towering over his faltering aggression, empathy and poise eclipsing bluster and entitlement. The nation's reaction was immediate. Clips of her takedown dominated trending lists. Interviews dissected every pause, every phrase. Social media buzzed with praise and validation. Finally, someone showed him what real power looks like. This is how leadership should sound: calm, firm, and unshakable. Millions of viewers felt a surge of inspiration, recognition, and hope. Crockett had not just defended herself, she had demonstrated that courage, composure, and truth could prevail over intimidation and arrogance. And in that moment, the narrative crystallized. Dignity had conquered entitlement. Poise had dismantled bluster. Every interruption, every attempt to silence had been neutralized, repurposed as a stage to showcase Crockett's unassailable strength. For the audience, it was a cathartic victory. For Sullivan, a public unraveling. For the nation, a lesson etched in real time. Respect, preparation, and moral clarity are forces far stronger than arrogance and noise. By the end of her counterattack, Crockett had turned the debate upside down. She had anticipated every tactic, absorbed every insult, and emerged not just unscathed, but triumphant. The applause, the hashtags, the viral clips all underscored a simple truth. This was the moment where dignity crushed arrogance, where restraint became a weapon, and where courage reshaped the narrative entirely.
The moment Crockett's words landed, the debate hall seemed to exhale. Cameras captured stunned faces, murmurs spread like wildfire, and then, almost instantaneously, the digital world ignited. Social media erupted with a force that no politician could ignore. Twitter feeds flooded with clips of the takedown. Every pause, every carefully measured word dissected and replayed. Hashtags multiplied, trending within minutes. Hashtag Crockett claps back. Hashtag shook. Hashtag dignity wins. Fans and critics alike scrolled frantically, sharing, commenting, and reacting, as though the nation itself had paused to witness this pivotal moment. TikTok exploded with rapid-fire edits, short clips emphasizing Sullivan's flustered expressions juxtaposed against Crockett's unshakable poise. Creators layered the footage with text overlays. Calm beats chaos. Dignity greater than arrogance. She didn't just respond, she commanded the room. Instagram Reels followed suit, and even Facebook, where older viewers debated the implications, became a hub of recognition and validation. The event was no longer just a political debate. It had transformed into a cultural moment, an emblem of resistance against entitlement. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. Political commentators dissected every second, replaying the exchange in slow motion to analyze tone, intent, and implication. Pundits debated whether Crockett had delivered the most effective debate performance of the year. Some framed it as a clash of personalities, others as a seismic shift in the narrative of what respectful debate should look like. Cable panels buzzed, streaming platforms posted highlight reels, and even morning shows the next day led with her measured dismantling of Sullivan. Supporters rallied in real time. Online forums and activist groups celebrated, calling Crockett's performance a masterclass in poise and power. Local communities held watch parties, reliving the moments together, sharing screenshots and clips with friends and neighbors. Her performance became a shared symbol for all those who had ever been silenced or interrupted. It wasn't just about winning a political argument. It was about reclaiming space, about asserting dignity in the face of arrogance. Critics, meanwhile, scrambled to shift the narrative. Sullivan's team released statements emphasizing policy, claiming the focus on interruption was overblown. Op-eds were drafted hastily, defending the veteran politician's approach, but the digital tide had already moved. The footage of Crockett's calm, deliberate dismantling of his interruptions had gone viral. It wasn't just news, it was social proof, validation that she had won more than points. She had won hearts and attention, and the momentum was unmistakable. For the audience, the emotional resonance ran deep. Crockett was not merely defending her own voice, she was defending the principle that every person deserves to be heard. Viewers saw themselves in her. Immigrants fighting to have their stories acknowledged, women navigating spaces dominated by entitlement, communities pushing for justice. Her words reverberated beyond the debate, offering a sense of validation, empowerment, and shared triumph. Social media didn't just capture the moment, it amplified the feeling that dignity could indeed overpower arrogance. Commentators began to connect the dots. Analysts pointed out how moments like these shape public perception, influence voter sentiment, and redefine what it means to lead with integrity. Influencers posted reaction videos detailing how Crockett's calm, authoritative response could inspire not just political engagement, but personal resilience. The message was clear. Leadership is measured not by volume or dominance, but by clarity, composure, and courage. And yet, even as the applause and online accolades swelled, there was a sense that this was just the beginning. Every clip shared, every reaction posted, every conversation sparked amplified the impact of her performance far beyond the walls of the debate hall. The ripples extended into communities, homes, offices, classrooms, and social feeds across the country. But the ripples didn't stop at the debate stage. As the digital applause continued to swell, Jasmine Crockett's presence on that debate stage began to take on a meaning far beyond any single moment or political victory. What had started as a clash of personalities, a battle of interruptions and rebuttals, had transformed into a demonstration of an essential truth. Dignity can outshine arrogance, calm can conquer bluster, and integrity can dismantle entitlement. Her words, carefully measured and deliberate, reframed what many had perceived as personal attacks into a universal lesson about leadership, respect, and the values that bind a democracy together. Crockett's counterattack had been more than a political maneuver. It was a demonstration of principle in action. She showed that strength does not lie in the ability to speak over others or dominate a room. Strength lies in the ability to listen, to respond with clarity, and to uphold the dignity of every person, regardless of their position or power. Every viewer who had felt overlooked, interrupted, or dismissed recognized themselves in her composure. She had turned an insult into a mirror, reflecting the society we aspire to be, a society in which voices are not silenced, where fairness prevails, and where truth is defended not through volume, but through conviction. The lesson was clear. Democracy functions best when respect is mutual, when dialogue is genuine, and when every voice is allowed its place. Crockett's calm authority reminded the nation that arrogance, no matter how loud or insistent, ultimately corrodes credibility, while dignity, patience, and moral courage inspire trust, admiration, and change. This was a moment that transcended politics. It was a reflection of shared values, of the principle that the true power of governance comes not from intimidation, but from integrity and service. Gender, too, played a powerful role in the lesson Crockett imparted.
in a space historically dominated by men. She embodied the quiet revolution of women asserting their right to speak, to be heard, and to lead without compromising their principles. Her refusal to be shouted down was a reminder to millions that respect is not given based on appearance or status. It is demanded through action and presence. For viewers who had faced bias in workplaces, classrooms, or their own communities, her composure was validation that courage and self-respect are transformative forces. Crockett also framed her victory within a broader sense of Americanness. This was not about party lines, ideology, or political allegiance alone. It was about the values the nation claims to uphold: fairness, opportunity, and justice for all. She turned a seemingly personal confrontation into a lesson about the civic and moral fabric that binds the country. The debate had exposed arrogance and entitlement, but it had also illuminated hope, resilience, and the power of principled action. Her example was a blueprint for leadership that values substance over spectacle, humanity over hubris. By the time she stepped away from the podium, Crockett had done more than defend herself. She had delivered a moral framework, a call to viewers to recognize that civility, empathy, and courage are not just virtues, they are tools of transformation. Her words weren't just a clapback, they were a mirror, reflecting what America still hopes to be: a nation in which respect triumphs over entitlement, where dignity is not negotiable, and where every person's story matters. For audiences watching, this wasn't the end of a debate. It was the beginning of a renewed understanding of leadership, of civic responsibility, and of the transformative power of courage tempered by grace. In that moment, Crockett became more than a politician. She became a symbol of the possibility inherent in every citizen, the possibility that even in the face of arrogance, integrity can prevail, and hope can inspire change.
As the cameras panned one final time, the contrast was undeniable. Dan Sullivan, flustered and shaken, could no longer hide the cracks in his composure. Across the stage, Jasmine Crockett stood tall, calm, and unwavering, a figure of dignity that radiated far beyond the lights and applause. In that moment, the story was clear. Arrogance had faltered, and integrity had prevailed. Every interruption, every attempt to silence her, had only highlighted the strength of her voice. For viewers, the message could not have been clearer. Dignity triumphs over bluster. Respect outweighs entitlement. Courage, guided by principle, will always outlast intimidation. Crockett's performance was more than a political victory. It was a moral victory, a reminder that speaking with conviction and defending what is right carries power that no volume or arrogance can match. The lesson echoes beyond the debate hall. In life, in communities, in democracy itself, dignity is not optional, it is essential. And this is where you come in. If you were inspired by her poise, if you felt your own story reflected in hers, don't let this moment pass quietly. Subscribe, share, and join a movement that values truth, courage, and justice. Amplify the voices that demand to be heard. Support leaders who act with integrity, and stand with those who turn adversity into inspiration. Because make no mistake, the debate may have ended, but the ripple effects are just beginning. The conversations, the lessons, the calls to action, they are all part of a larger movement. And as Jasmine Crockett showed the nation what is possible when dignity meets courage, one truth remains unmistakable. This story isn't over. It's just beginning.